people here as well as their reaction to God above. And then as we get to the end of Daniel chapter 9, you and I will recognize from Daniel chapter 11, Daniel chapter 10, and Daniel chapter 12 that all of these things that are taking place are leading him up to the conclusion, and listen to this conclusion of the book of Daniel, that God is in control. I want you to see that. I hope you've seen that in every chapter and in every study we've had since we started the book of Daniel. So let's pick up and let's start ourselves this evening in Daniel chapter 11 as we go through Daniel 11, 10, and 12, looking at some kingdom changes that will take place. The three areas that we'll look at some kings in Daniel chapter 11, and I'll explain the outline in just a moment. Then we will go to Daniel chapter 10, and we will notice a conflict that Daniel's having within himself, that Daniel's struggling with as he's taking all of this information. By the way, what would you do with the information that Daniel was given? All right, let me ask one simple question. Who wants to be a Daniel with all this information he's been given? Kind of makes you sink down in the seat, doesn't it? Because Daniel's faced, in chapter 1, he's in captivity. He has to stand up and either defile himself before God or claim that he's not going to defile himself before man. He's faced telling kings, your kingdom is over. He's faced telling successors of kingdoms, your kingdom is over. He's faced telling kings, you're going to be like the wild beast for a period of time, but your kingdom will be there and then it will be over. Daniel almost never gets to give good news, does he? And even in these chapters, especially as we get down to Daniel chapter 12, we're going to look at some imagery in these chapters. And especially as we get into Daniel chapter 9, you and I will recognize that Daniel is burdened with a great bit of information. Matter of fact, in one of our chapters tonight, we're going to learn that Daniel is the only one who receives this information. And even Daniel is still confounded about some of the things that he sees. So let's start off in Daniel chapter 11 and let's look at the kings. And what I want you to do with me for just a moment is let's just notice how the chapter is broken down. Because tonight we will not be able to look at Daniel 11, Daniel 10, and Daniel 12 in that order in every verse. However, I want you to get an outline of this chapter that will help you as you go through this chapter and as you read it again later. And then we're going to notice about 5 verses from each chapter until we get to chapter 12. And all of these are outlined in your outline and handout for you as well. So I want you to see as you open up Daniel chapter 11, here's what you read in verse 1. Also, I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Let me ask you this question, okay? Who is Daniel serving? You don't have to be specific. It's happened all throughout the book. There are 2 that Daniel has served, and we need to see both of them tonight as we open up. Daniel has served God. Isn't that true? By the way, what happened in Daniel chapter 6? Remember what happened in Daniel chapter 6? Anybody remember? All right, there's a lion, there's a den, and there's a Daniel. You can't pray, Daniel. Who did he serve? He served God. Now, Daniel also, as he is in captivity, who did he serve? He served the king. Specifically in Daniel chapter 11, it's listed, it is Darius the Mede, and he stood to confirm and to strengthen Darius the Mede. What I want you to see as we open up Daniel chapter 11 is Daniel's living in captivity. Daniel has not had the best life as you and I would describe it, but yet look at what he's doing. He's serving God, and he's serving the powers that be inside of the world of which he exists. And as you look through Daniel chapter 11, you're going to see how the future kingdoms are going to be a little bit different. And just as you and I noticed in the past, and as we'll look in the future in Daniel chapter 9 and 10 and 12 tonight, that Daniel continues to serve God, and Daniel continues to serve those who are in power. I believe that's a lesson for us tonight to take away. We can always, as Christians, serve God. And at the same time, we can be respectable and respectful to our world. By the way, that's the Romans chapter 13 life. If you need to know more about that, you read that tonight. And you'll learn about living under the ordinances of man. You go on through scriptures about doing the right things in this world, even sometimes when they're uncomfortable or something that we would not want to do. Daniel did that, didn't he? He served his God. He served his king. By the way, notice this. Was Daniel's king in Daniel chapter 11 the king of his own nation? Where is Daniel? Remind yourself of this. Sometimes I think we read the book of Daniel and we forget this. Where was Daniel? Captivity. He wasn't at home. You and I are at home tonight, aren't we? We're among our own people tonight, aren't we? Not just Christians, but as we live in our community, where are we? We're at home. Everything for us is normal, but Daniel is in captivity. Remember that. So you have Daniel, and you see in verses 1 and 2, you see this rule of Persia. Matter of fact, the kings of Persia are mentioned inside of verse 2. And as you end verse 2, you start to talk about the rule of Greece. This begins verses 3 and 4. You look at verses 5 through 20, and you will see that they're going to see Syria and they're going to see Egypt rise up. Verses 21 through 35, you're going to see the evil Syrian king that's going to rise. And even in verses 36 through verse 45 to end out Daniel chapter 11, you will see a self-willed king. Now here's what I want you to know. We're going to look at 5 verses in just a minute from Daniel 11. But here's what I want you to know. Anytime that you and I only serve the king of this land, we'll fail. Let me say that again. Anytime we serve the king of this land only, we will fail. I don't care who is president. I don't care what you call him. If we only serve this world, we set ourselves up for failure. Thus keep Daniel chapter 11, verse 1. He was respectful to the king. He helped the king, but yet he also took care of his life inside of God. Look with me in Daniel chapter 11, verse 5, and specifically notice some of these verses. Verse 5 reads this way, "And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion." All right, here's what's happening, Daniel 11, verse 5. It's still happening today. By the way, we might say it this way. It has always been happening. People are always going to grasp for power. By the way, in Daniel 11, verse 5, it's this word, dominion. The more territory you control, the more power you have in this world. And you'll notice this not only from the early chapters of the book of Daniel, but also here in chapter 11, as you see these different kings, as they're going to rise and fall in the future, what are they after? They're after power. Now, let's illustrate something to ourselves. If we only serve the earthly king, why will we fail? If we only serve the earthly king, why will we fail? Well, they're only concerned about an earthly dominion, aren't they? That's why I want you to center in on that word inside of verse 5 of Daniel 11. They were concerned about this dominion, this great dominion that they were going to have, and it's all that they could see. Maybe a great lesson for a nation in Daniel chapter 11, as you walk through these different kingdoms, is to recognize that this world is not about physical power. Now, certainly don't take me wrong. Is it good for a nation to be able to defend itself? Well, of course. Is it good for a nation to be able to keep law and order in its streets? Of course. But what happens when this great dominion, this great power becomes the only thing that we focus after? We no longer see the eternal. And thus these nations that we look here are only focused in on the world. Look at verse 27 as you roll through this rather long chapter. I know we can't look at all the things, but let's see how the leadership of the world lined up, and then let's ask ourselves a question after reading verse 27. And both of these kings, these are later kings, you can read about them in verse 5 down to verse 26. And both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. 2 things to learn from verse 27. Number 1. All right, now this is a yes or no answer, okay? You can say it out loud if you'd like. You can keep it to yourself if you'd like, but it's a yes or no. Have politicians ever lied? All right, you see why I said keep it to yourself. Now let me ask you another one. Will politicians lie in the future? Earthly centric, earthly centric, earthly centric. Power, dominion. They do so at these tables. You know, those really important dinners where things get done. Those really important meetings where the doors are closed. And they do so just so that their kingdom can prosper in the physical. And yet, here we learn about these people. They're going to do these things, and yet they shall not prosper. But I want you to see something in verse 27. This helps us understand something about God. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Who is in charge of the rise and fall of nations? It's not us. And thus I want you to see as we go through these 3 chapters tonight, that's the theme that Daniel's learning. Because there's going to be in Daniel chapter 9 a timeline given. And we're going to divide that timeline out and look at it. It'll be in your resource next week that you can pick up here. We had major printing problems this afternoon. Otherwise, you would have had next week's handout. But I decided not to throw the printer down the stairs today, so I'll try to print those next week. But as you go through this, all of this is building up to this point where Daniel's going to see it all, and then we just don't know what else comes. But here's the truth. God is in control because He appoints the times, He appoints the seasons, He appoints everything. And even though they don't happen on our timetable, whose timetable is always right? It's God's timetable. And thus all of these nations are changing around them, verse 27, but it's about God's time. Look at verse 29 again. And at the appointed time He shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Anybody ever made plans? Every one of us. Anybody ever had your plans work out every time? It's verse 29. These kings, they're building their empires, they're doing all these things, and they're going to come back to this, and it's not going to be what they thought it was going to be. Why? Because things don't happen on our timetable. Another indication to you and I and to Daniel that you and I are not in control of this world. Who's in control of the world? The rise and fall of nations? It's God. Rather, it's interesting to me that as you study the book of Daniel, we're really focusing less on history, even though you and I could go through Daniel chapter 11 and we could trace out all of this in the history of the world. By the way, it's not just the Bible. We can look at history books and see it all unfold just as found in Daniel 11. But we're learning less about the world and we're learning more about the time that has been appointed, which is a key factor to what? It's all the way through the book. Who's in control? God. Just as much as Daniel in that lion's den, God took care of him there, God is going to take care of everything that takes place. Roll into verse 32 of Daniel chapter 11, and you'll see the next thing that we need to notice. These same kings, these same people, they'll strengthen themselves, they'll do abominations, verse 31, and they'll do such as do quickly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do their exploits. All right, here it is, verse 32. The world may be against people that follow God. That may happen in our lives. Has that ever happened in your lifetime? People oppose godly people? That has happened. Has that ever stopped God? Here's what we need to learn from verse 32. Our experiences in this life that come from other people, I'm talking about the world's view toward Christianity. It's not a positive view, is it? Should that change our view on God because they're mean? Or can we, look at verse 32, the people that follow after God, can we be strong? Just imagine being in the life of Daniel for just a minute. Imagine going up to all of these kings he's went to and said, your kingdom's coming to an end. How many of us would nerve out about king number 2? Or on the way into king number 1? Or how many of us would go kicking and screaming into the lion's den? By the way, interesting to note, Daniel 6, Daniel went willingly. That's interesting to me. And here we see Daniel, And he knows all of these things are going to take place, and it's Daniel's job to proclaim these things, and it's not good news, but it is. Verse 32. Because you and I, as people of God, though the world may turn against us as followers of God, we can be strong. Because who is in control? That's the key, I believe, of verse 32. It's God that is in control. And as you roll into verse 37, listen to this. This is these people. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor desire the women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Look at verse 38 and 39. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God of whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and precious things. Thus shall he do in the midst of strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. What are we back to again as this chapter kind of comes to a close? All about dominion, all about power, all about this great nation we're going to build. But who have they forgotten? Now chapter 11, this is how it ends. Daniel, any nation that's going to stand has to stand with God. Hasn't that been true? Look at history. When nations forget God, what happens? They decline. That's how we started, remember? If we as individuals live for the king and not for the king, we will fail. And the same is true about nations, because here's the truth. There are going to be kings. They're going to rise and fall. Kingdoms are going to change. But God has never changed his position, has he? God has always been God. By the way, here's an interesting statement for you as we transition into chapter 10. We're going to see this great conflict, really a shorter chapter inside of the book of Daniel, just 21 verses. But we need to recognize something. This is a statement we need to tell ourselves. Answer me a question, okay? Now don't get mad at me when I ask it. Just think about it. Let it kind of reason with you. Does God need the United States of America? That's right. We certainly need God. But his will is going to be accomplished whether we do it or not. His word will never return void. And thus, if we follow after the ways of the world and only worry about this earthly empire, we will fail. So Daniel, you're getting ready to face some tough days, but how can you have strength? You stand with God and not the kings. That's Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 10, let's notice the conflict that Daniel is going to have. This is just a simple outline. It's twofold in nature. Verses 1 through 4 is Daniel's vexation. Daniel has faced things that you and I will hopefully never face, and he's going to be left kind of perplexed about it. And then there's going to be this visitation in Daniel chapter 10 that we'll notice in just a moment. Let's notice verse 1 of Daniel 10. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. And the thing was true, but the time appointed was long, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. All right, now Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. Who was this shown to? Well, it wasn't the king, and it wasn't the people. God didn't show himself. Who was it shown to? Daniel. Now, here's what's going to happen in chapter 10. Daniel's going to learn. Daniel's going to learn that the road is going to be hard. I want you to notice with me a few verses. Notice with me verse 3. I didn't intend on us looking at this, but verse 2 and 3. In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Have you ever had bad news that kept you away from the things you're used to, accustomed to for 3 whole weeks? Now, we've seen Daniel faint and be astonished for 3 days, but now for 21 days, Daniel is left in this perplexed mode because what's getting ready to be told him Number one, from verse 1, he understood the thing. Which, by the way, in most chapters in the book of Daniel, God ensures that Daniel knows what all of these things mean. That's chapter 10. Daniel knows what this means. Look at verse 5. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed with linen, whose loins were girded with a fine gold. Daniel's going to be visited. And in this visitation, Daniel is going to be comforted, even though Daniel is going to learn some things that are difficult. Look at verse 7. And I, Daniel, look at the next word. And I, Daniel, from verse 7. What's the next word? Alone saw the vision, for the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, so they fled to hide themselves. How would you like to be Daniel in Daniel 10, verse 7? He's among people, and this vision's coming, and there's this great quaking of the earth, so that all other men leave you, and you are alone. Now, it might surprise you to think about Daniel as someone who is alone, but do this sometime. Just read through the book of Daniel from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 10, and just notice how many times Daniel was alone. And by the way, reference that to Christianity. You and I, like Daniel, must respect our government, because who ordains governments? God does. Remember Romans 13? God ordains the powers that be. Who's in control of the rise and fall of nations? Still God, isn't it? Now think about the Christian life for just a minute. Is the Christian life the most popular life? Is it? Are you going to live popularity contests saying marriage is between one man, one woman for life? Are you going to win popularity contests saying that we must live pure lives? You get laughed at. Daniel got thrown in a lion's den. They wrote laws so Daniel would have to break them. Think about that. Anybody ever done that to you? No. No one has ever done that to us, but we've been called mean names. What I'm trying to get you to recognize tonight is you and I live in a blessed time. Has 2020 been a good year? Be careful with your answer. It's been tough, but let me tell you, it's still been a good year, because who is still in control? I don't know why anything happens. Do you? We think we do. No, we watch the news, we watch our political arena, we watch all these things, and we think we know what's going on. Daniel didn't know either. And yet he was vexed and he was visited, and all these things took place, and he was alone. You and I may live on our individual lives, a lonely life. But let me ask you a question from Daniel 10, verse 7. Was Daniel alone? Was Daniel alone? Now, men left him, but who was still with him? Remember, he was visited. That came from God. So many times we feel alone. You ever went to lunch by yourself and had a pity party because you were alone? Me too. You ever thought you were the only person doing what was right? And nobody wants to answer that, but I know your answer. Me too. Daniel wasn't alone, and you and I are not alone. We'll never be alone. Even when we are in our sins, ladies and gentlemen, are we alone? What did Jesus do to the one who left the 99? He didn't leave that one alone. Daniel wasn't alone. People left him, and here he was. All this happened, and men, listen, verse 7, they may hide themselves from the face of God. Let me ask you this question. Let me ask you, Jonah, can you hide from God? I know we're crossing into another book here, but can you hide from God, Jonah? How far did Jonah go to hide from God? To the depths of the sea. And yet, when he prayed, who heard him? God did. Daniel was not alone. And Daniel needed to recognize, as we need to recognize, you can't hide your face from God. You may hide your face from men. By the way, this I believe is twofold. You may hide your true identity, your true actions from men, but God will know. The old two-face playing the actor. Who's going to always know? Well, the same one that never will leave you alone. You may feel that way, but you're not. Verse 11 reads in this way, this one said unto him, he touches in verse 10, and he says, verse 11, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved. Pause with me there. I hope that we live our life. Now, I know that God's not sending messages to us, but just hear me what I'm saying. I hope we live our life that if God said something to us through His messengers, He says that we are greatly beloved. Why was Daniel greatly beloved? Was it because he was a politician? Daniel was a politician. It's because he followed God. That's exactly what took place. You want to be beloved of God? You love God before expecting anything in return. That was Daniel. Oh, man greatly beloved, he says, understand the words that I speak unto thee. By the way, pause with me. Is God the author of confusion? No. Now, there are some hard things to understand in Scripture. There are some things, even in the book of Daniel, that we have looked at and we have said, don't know what that means. Just remember something about the book of Daniel. Who did these events take place with? Daniel. And answer this question to yourself. What's your name? Now, unless somebody in here is a Daniel, we kind of get the point, don't we? He says, understand these things. Now listen to this. And stand upright. Why? Verse 7, you're not alone. Men may have forsaken Daniel, but God has not forsaken him. I'm now sent. And when he had spoken this word unto me, I stood trembling. I guess we would too. I don't know what it would be like, Hebrews chapter 12, 1 and 2, for God like He spoke to the fathers and the prophets. I guess I would tremble like Daniel too. I guess after going in the lion's den and surviving that, and now I know I'm getting a glimpse of the future. By the way, Daniel is one of the few that gets a major glimpse into the next many years. I know in Isaiah, and I know in Ezekiel, and I know in Jeremiah, there are some small proclamations that take place with nations, but Daniel has been told major things. Rise and fall of at least 5 different nations in the future. And he stands trembling before God because God wanted him to understand the word that was spoken. He's going to talk about Persia again as he falls through and the other nations. But notice with me verses 14 and 15. Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. For yet the vision is for many days. Look at the word many. That's a supplied word. This vision is for days. Now, there are a lot of false things that come out of the book of Daniel. And we're going to look at some of those next week. So don't play into a lot of this language tonight because we're going to see a lot of it flushed out next week, especially as we get into the latter part of chapter 12 here in just a moment. This is for days. Verse 15, and when he had spoken such word unto me, I set my face toward the ground, and I became dumb. You ever heard something that blew your mind? There's Daniel. Now, we think we hear things that blow our mind, but Daniel has just been revealed, and it's being revealed unto Daniel. Here's the future. Wouldn't that be nice? May I suggest to you it probably wouldn't be. Because Daniel looks to the ground, and it's as if he's dumb, as if he just can't process what's going on. By the way, in the New Testament, we learn something about the future. The evil for today is sufficient for when? For today. Let tomorrow take care of itself, don't we? Many times, we try to worry about tomorrow before we worry about today. And I feel like that's the reaction of Daniel. He's seeing all these things, and he can't get out of the lion's den, if you'll allow me to say it that way perversely. So here is Daniel. He's vexed in all of these things, which leads us, ladies and gentlemen, to Daniel chapter 12. I know we've jumped around in these things in the order of what's taking place, but we're still in this conversation that's taking place because look at verse 1. Now we're going to look at 1, 2, 3, and 4 and summarize verses 5 through 13 in our lesson this evening. And at that time shall Michael stand up with thee, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. All right, verse 1, Daniel, there's some suffering that's coming in the future. If you look at God's people from the time of the book of Daniel to the last pages of the Old Testament, was there suffering in God's people? There was, wasn't there? When you get into the New Testament times, do you ever read opportunities and times where Christians suffered? Now, there's two ways to look at this. I believe chapter 12 is pointing to the people and to the times that we're reading about. Many people will look way into the future and try to look into today and say, this is talking about today, the last days. But remember what's happening. This rise and fall of nations. Where did it end? What came out of all those 5 nations in the first part of the book? What was coming? What kingdom was going to be established that shall never be torn apart? The church. I believe we're looking to the point where the church enters in. And thus, till we get to the point the church enters in, there is great tribulation among God's people. By the way, even when Jesus was upon the face of this earth, was there not great tribulation with Jesus? There was, wasn't there? There's going to be this great suffering. There's going to be a separation, verse 2. Many that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Now, some would like to say, verse 2, that this is talking about the end of days. I don't think that's what it's talking about. You get into the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the books of Matthew, Mark, you read a lot of things that take place. Verse 3, there's going to be this shining. And they shall be wise, or they that be wise shall shine as brightness of the firmament, and they that turn to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Verse 3 may be the key of chapter 12. If you stay with God, where will you be? With God. Where is wisdom found, by the way? Is wisdom found in the world? I know the world's smart. I don't want to diminish the world. A lot of good things the world has done, don't you agree? But what about the wisdom of God? Which one's better, the world or God? By the way, who created God? Was it the world? Or was it God who created the world? Helps us understand that. If we will stay with God, by the way, people in captivity, verse 3, if they will stay with God, by the way, all that Daniel's trying to promote, from Daniel chapter 1 to Daniel chapter 12, is stay with God. That's why in the beginning of this book, he says, don't make me defile myself before God. What was it about? Faithfulness to the end. Now why does Daniel and do we need to be faithful to the end? Who's in control? That's the theme of this book. Probably not the theme you expected us to see. So you have this shining, you have this sealing, verse 4. Now, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even the time to the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. These things are coming to an end, Daniel. Now, there's this prediction, there's this thing that's going to take place in Daniel chapter 9 as we come to a conclusion of this book next week. But here's what's happening. Who is in control? God is, over and over. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you, there are a lot of things that are going to take place from Daniel chapter 12, verse 5 down to verse 13. And let me give you the best statement I can give you about verse 5 down to verse 13. I don't know. I don't know all the answers. Some of these things we can figure out. Some of these things we'll struggle with. But here's what I know, and you can look at a lot of writers about this. There's a time coming. There's a time coming, verse 10, where people will be purified. And there's a time coming when the wicked shall continue to do wickedness. Now, put yourself in the very shoes of Daniel. what has not taken place yet? Christ. Now think about this in the old law. Did the Old Testament law forgive sins? Therefore, there has not been a time when people could be purified because whose blood has not been shed. By the way, remember that kingdom that's going to be established, who was it? Christ is going to establish his kingdom. All these other nations will rise and they will fall, but the kingdom of Christ will be established and it will never be destroyed. Remember Daniel 2, verse 44? Keep that in your mind. That's the crux of the chapter. The crux of the book is 2:44. Knowing that the kingdom of Christ was going to be established. Now, all the ups and downs of the other nations, who appointed them? It was God. And thus there are these days that are talked about until the end, and there's going to be an end of these days. Now, what's going to help us is when we make it to Daniel chapter 9. Now, you can go ahead and look at Daniel chapter 9 tonight. We're not going to get in it. But we're going to see some things take place, especially as we get down to verse 24. The first bit of Daniel chapter 9, we'll introduce it tonight, is going to be this prayer. And Daniel's going to pray this prayer. He's going to petition God for something. But then there's this time span. And that's why we're choosing to end this book at this time span, because when we see all these things become complete, who has arrived? Who arrives after the Old Testament is ended? That's what we're pointing to next week as we roll into our study of the book of Daniel. Now, let's think about for just a minute the invitation as we conclude our study this evening about these 3 chapters. Now, here's what we learned tonight from Daniel chapter 11, Daniel chapter 10, and Daniel chapter 12 in that order. Here's what we learned. God is in control. Now, the reason we study these 3 chapters is because if we did them individually, we would be coming for the next 3 weeks. God is in control. God is in control. God is in control. I want you to see it as a whole. Guess what? Still in control. But that leaves us with a question. Yes, we know God is in control of this world. We get it. I think we've beat that into our minds, don't we? Don't we understand that God is in control? He was then, He still is. But this is where we've got to ask a question, and it's going to play into a song that we're going to sing in just a minute, the invitation song about a fountain. Here's the question. If God is in control of this world, now you ask this of you as I ask it of me, is God in control of me? If God can command the rise and fall of nations, what is He commanding of me? All these kingdom changes, chapter 11, chapter 10, chapter 12, all of those things took place. Even Daniel, who was perplexed and confounded for those 3 weeks, still continued on. So here's our question tonight. Is God in control of us? Well, the good news is, depending on how we answer that as to what we need to do. You see, the invitation song is not so that we can respond to the preacher or the elders or the deacons or the members. It's so that we can respond to the God who is in control and allow Him to take control of our lives once again. Maybe tonight you need to become a Christian. It takes a lot of humility to become a Christian, doesn't it? Because you have to let go of self, my ways, my wishes, my wants, my desires, my cares, my way, and follow after the Lord. You know, if entire nations can do as God commands, can't we as individuals? Maybe you need to become a Christian tonight. You make that decision and you can enter into a watery grave of baptism. Maybe you're a Christian tonight and you need to come back home. If God can make the nations fall, He can make our hearts fall too. And maybe we need to do that tonight. We'll have to make that determination, knowing that God's people will pray for us. The angels in heaven will rejoice when the sinner turns back home. That's a good call that we have tonight. Maybe you need to come forward tonight. Maybe you need to become a Christian. Maybe you need to make your life right with the Lord. Why don't you let that be known as together we stand and sing.